So that should be recording now. So yeah, like I said, this is going to be negotiating uncomfortable feelings of collaboration, reflections from early career researchers, hosted by myself, Ella, Sylvia, and Victoria. And yeah, for those people that are not presenting, if you could please kind of turn off your microphones when other people are speaking, that would be great. And there is a closed caption feature down at the bottom if you want that or require that. Other than that, I just wanted to kind of say that this kind of presentation was actually born out of conversations I had at a graduate student pre-conference at COSI 2023, where I actually met Sylvia. So this is kind of showing how networking kind of does well within this organization. And then there was further networking opportunities where I was able to meet Victoria through the IECA. And then we kind of developed this idea, and we had similar reflections on kind of negotiating our uncomfortable feelings of collaboration. So that is what we will be talking about today. So I'm going to hand over to Victoria, and then yeah.
Thank you very much, Ella, and thank you everyone for joining us today for negotiating uncomfortable feelings of collaboration. So before we begin, I'd like to start off with the word symbiosis. So I imagine you may have heard this word. It means collaboration between different living organisms. And I don't know what kind of images this word conjures up for you, but I usually imagine the flowers and bees and that sort of thing. But instead here I chose a crocodile's teeth being cleaned. And yes, this might be a myth, but I chose it because I know if you're the one cleaning the mouth of the croc, you might feel pretty uncomfortable. And I think similarly, when we think of collaboration, we imagine smiling, handshaking, but it's not always that. So this is what we're here to talk about today. So what will the next hour or so look like? There will be an open part to this discussion. But first off, Sylvia will be starting with her insights on collaborating with journalists. And then we'll be hearing from Ella, who will share perspectives on collaboration with NGOs. And then I'll tell you my story about collaborating with decision makers in governmental organizations. So Sylvia, whenever you're ready.
Yep, hi everyone. Thanks for the introduction. So my name's Sylvia Hayes. I finished my PhD this year. I'm now working as a postdoc at the University of Exeter in the UK. And my PhD research was a collaborative project focusing on journalists and photographers in the sort of UK news media ecosystem in a climate change context. So I did this research called Navigating the Use of Visuals in the Production of Digital Climate Change Journalism. So the focus was on online-only digital media about climate change. And I worked with this organisation called Carbon Brief, which are a London-based digital news organisation which produce sort of science and energy reporting about climate change. So quite expertise, quite scientific focused reporting, not sort of general breaking news. It was quite focused on reporting on the latest climate science and sort of energy issues and politics around the sort of transition in the UK. So through that work, I spent 4 months working on a placement with this organisation. So I was there embedded in their team as a journalist. And that was the main part of my data collection. It was a sort of ethnographic approach to research. So I was there working for them as a journalist, helping out their organisation, but at the same time collecting data for my PhD. So that was a sort of dual role that was really quite tricky to navigate at times. Sort of trying to, meet their needs, but also get the data I needed for my PhD. It was a really excellent experience and I really enjoyed it, but I was very aware the whole time of all these sort of uncomfortable feelings and just sort of difficulties and things we had to keep negotiating as we went through because it was a collaborative project. So I've just been really struck by how my experience of doing that didn't really match what I read in the literature about collaborative projects, particularly in an environmental context, which is why I sort of prompted conversations with other ECRs throughout my PhD to sort of bring to light some of these issues that I was experiencing. And I've actually published twice on sort of experiences and difficulties of working collaboratively with organisations. So I've got these 2 papers here. They're both written with other ECRs, other PhD students from my university, reflecting on these experiences and what could be done more to support ECRs working in this space. So if you can move on slides. Thank you. So the first issue I want to raise is a more sort of practical thing. So, you know, we talk about uncomfortable feelings, and a lot of that can come from really quite sort of practical and explicit things like money and time. So resources, another way of putting it. So this is a table from one of the papers I worked on with a colleague. And we basically sort of costed up. It's sort of an estimate, obviously, but this is a sort of costing up of a research support. So in the UK, we get this thing called RTSG as PhD students who are funded, which is a research support training grant. And this is the pot of money we use to conduct all our research. So things like travel to do interviews, if you're paying participants, if you're attending conferences, that's the budget for all of that. And my budget for that was not huge. I think it was around £700 per year. Obviously in the social sciences, we maybe don't get as much as the natural sciences. And it varies on funding body, but we sort of mocked up this idea of, you know, a sort of journey of a PhD, what you would maybe spend your money on. And you can see in this column on the right that the sort of bits where it goes beyond what a lot of people end up getting is these additional collaborative costs. And yeah, obviously it's not based on anyone specifically necessarily, but it's just to sort of give an example that there are costs that are additional when you're doing collaborative research that maybe come on a bit more than just traditional qualitative research that isn't collaborative. So this was definitely the case for me. I had to travel back and forth because I was doing this placement. I traveled back and forth from Exeter to London every week, basically, throughout the 4 months. And that's obviously a huge cost. With train travel in the UK is really expensive. Hotels in London were really expensive. So it really added up. And I had to do other things, which were, because of this collaborative relationship, I hosted feedback workshops. I hosted, I produced this report for them, which I'll talk about a bit later, but that had a high cost of printing. And obviously some of these things would be costs associated with a PhD that wasn't collaborative, but I think because I had this element of collaboration in my funding, it was expectations that I would do these additional things. And one of the other major things was I paid for a lot of dinners for the team that I was working with. So if I sort of interviewed people or, you know, worked in this team and then we sort of went out for dinner afterwards, sometimes that was on me to pay for as a sort of part of the collaborative process, which obviously added up as well. And I basically just found that I was spending a lot more than my sort of colleagues or my peers who were doing PhDs, which maybe just involved interviews or something. So this is something I've just wanted to highlight, that it can actually be quite a high cost for collaborative research. And in particular, my funding that I got was, I applied to it through a collaborative route. So it was specifically funding for collaborative research projects. So there's sort of a lot of expectations there around what counts as collaboration. And the sort of expectations, but despite it being a collaborative funding track, there wasn't additional money for collaboration. And it was, I just want to highlight as well that when I applied for funding in the first place, I was sort of advised by potential supervisors and other people to go specifically for this collaborative track because it was more likely to get funded. So it's a little bit of a cynical approach that I wouldn't necessarily have chosen a collaborative route, but I was encouraged to do so because it was more likely to be a successful application. And obviously, I very much can see the benefits of collaborative research, and I think it was absolutely the right way to go. But at the time, I maybe wouldn't have chosen that if it wasn't seen as more easy to get funding. So it's just interesting to see there, and this is one of the points we make in one of our papers, that the sort of institution of funding in the UK is very much set up to encourage and sort of push people towards collaborative research. But then when you're in and actually doing that research, there isn't the resources there to actually help you do that. So funding is one example. Another example that I haven't really got time to touch on is the amount of time you have to do a project as well. So you don't get additional time to do collaborative research, even though building those relationships and maintaining that relationship does take a lot more time than just perhaps doing some interviews or sort of focus groups or things like that. So yeah, next slide. The second thing I want to talk about is a bit more sort of personal on positionality and relationships. So as I said, I was in this team of journalists. It's a relatively small team, so it was quite intimate. And I was with them for 4 months, which is a decent chunk of time. I was doing this research during COVID. It wasn't in the height of the pandemic, but it was sort of towards the end of 2021. So there were still masks and things, and people weren't going to the office all the time. So in fact, a lot of the team members actually hadn't met each other in person at the time I was joined. So I was very much there as another new team member. So we all met up and went to Glasgow for COP26 in November of 2021. So that was my first sort of initial sort of introduction to the team, and it was very full on and very intense. And obviously being in the space with people, you can see here there was quite a lot of young team members, a lot of people around my sort of age with a lot of the same interests as me, obviously climate change and journalism. So we got on really well, and I actually stayed in an accommodation with one of the team members when we were in Glasgow, so we got to know each other really well, you know, sharing breakfast and chatting at night before we went to bed and stuff. So I sort of came across this idea of researcher as friend. There's different sort of iterations of this in the literature, but it was quite helpful for me to understand that it wasn't necessarily a bad thing that I had made friends with my participants, because it can feel a bit complicated, that relationship between sort of a researcher and the participant. But I was sort of reading around and feeling maybe this isn't a bad thing. It's actually quite nice, and it's given me access to a lot more data than perhaps I would have got otherwise, because these people trusted me. And we did build up genuine friendships, and I still see these people today, and we meet up when I'm in London, and it's really nice to see them again. But one of the things that comes along with is this difficulty of managing confidential information, because obviously as people come to trust me and see me as a friend and a colleague, not just a researcher, they were sharing information with me about the organisation, which perhaps they wouldn't have done if I was just interviewing as a non-team member. So it was really on me to sort of manage the expectations of what was confidential and what was off the record. And obviously working in a journalist space, that sort of language of off the record was quite handy to be able to sort of me immediately know, I won't write this down, this won't be treated as data, this is something you're sharing in confidence. So I appreciated that. And it was just a continual negotiation of ethics. So there's this idea of ethics in process, which is a sort of ethics continues throughout the whole thing. It's not just the ethics application you do at the beginning of your research. You have to keep negotiating that. And I did have to keep having conversations with people throughout the whole research about the sort of ethics of doing this and where the line was in terms of what you're allowed to tell me and what you don't tell me, and what I write down and what I don't write down. And there was a lot of back and forth around pseudonyms. And if I did have a recorded interview with one of the team members, I would send it to them afterwards and say, are you happy with everything you said? Do you want to change anything? There was a lot of things like that, which I wasn't necessarily prepared for going in. It wasn't something I knew was going to happen. It very much just sort of came out of my own intuition and sort of what was appropriate at the time. And the last thing I'll say on this is it was quite tricky at the end of this placement to sort of extract myself. So I had to go from being really immersed in this team and working for them and feeling very, very connected and embedded in the team. You know, I had their T-shirt, I had their badge, I had a little laptop sticker. I felt very much like one of the team. So then to come away from that back to the university setting and treat all that information and all that data as just a pseudonym and data that I was supposed to be a bit detached from was really tricky. And this is where we sort of come into issues of sort of situated knowledge and positionality and understanding sort of your embeddedness as a person in the research. So I did a lot of reading around that, which I found really interesting. But yeah, I found it quite tricky to sort of extract myself and feel like I was able to be distant and researching them from the outside, because these people were my friends. So it's just a really tricky thing there that I think I wasn't necessarily prepared for going in, and I didn't have anyone else in my cohort of PhD students that I could speak to about these issues, which is why I think it's really important to open up these kind of conversations. So if you move on slide. Thanks. So yeah, just quickly, the other issue I had to deal with was dissemination and sort of communicating my research. Obviously, working with this team of journalists, they weren't social scientists. A lot of them came from a physical science background, so the sort of social science was all quite new to them and confusing. And I wanted to be able to share my research with them in a way that wasn't too academic, because they're all very highly intelligent people who read science papers all the time. But I wanted a way of communicating in a bit more of a suited way for them. So I produced this report towards the end of my PhD. This is just a screenshot of all the pages. I've got it printed in a little booklet. And it's essentially just going through my findings in quite a lot of detail. I have a shorter version as well. And then a sort of recommendations at the end. And this took quite a lot of time. And this is what I mean about resources and time and funding for collaborative research, because this took quite a lot of time towards the end when I was writing up. And I really wanted to get it done out of a duty of care to my partner's organisation. But it wasn't a requirement for the PhD. It didn't benefit my PhD in any way whatsoever. It was just that I felt like I had this duty to do it. So yeah, additional time, additional sort of expectations of collaborative research. And again, this is something that you don't necessarily have the skill set for. I felt a bit out of my depth making this, because we don't necessarily get given the skills to produce these sort of non-academic outputs throughout the PhD, but it's something that's quite important if you're doing collaborative research in a lot of cases. So there's just some quick reflections from me. Obviously, could keep talking about this forever, so I'll hand over now to Ella, I think, who's had, a lot of similar experiences. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Sylvia. Yeah, just some very similar experiences to Sylvia, and I will kind of go through those, but also in a slightly different way as well. So it would be quite interesting to do some sort of comparison maybe at the end. But yeah, I'm Ella Muncie. I'm kind of taking this NGO activism perspective. I'm currently just coming towards the completion of my PhD at the University of Leicester in the Department of Media and Communication. So my project was funded by the ESRC, and I applied to it. So it was pre-written, and it was pre-written as a collaborative studentship with Greenpeace International. So when I kind of joined onto the PhD, I knew that I would be taking a collaborative approach. And I think in my mind, and I think like what Sylvia said, I had this expectation of what maybe this collaborative approach would be like. That I'd be quite embedded, that maybe I would maybe be working within the team, providing insights into them. But as you'll kind of see, that kind of maybe didn't materialize in actual practice. But yeah, my PhD title is Campaigning for the Future and the Future of Campaigning, a case of Greenpeace International and the emergence of new environmental communication landscapes. And it's looked particularly at their Alternative Futures campaign, which is advocating for different economic alternatives to capitalism, essentially, and particularly taking a global south perspective and how we can elevate those voices across the Greenpeace network on a global scale. Yeah, okay, next slide, please, Victoria. So yeah, one of the main kind of things that challenges I really faced was gaining and maintaining access. So despite, like I said, having this kind of formal collaboration already written down, and had signed a studentship agreement with Greenpeace International and had signed a non-disclosure agreement with them, it didn't actually really mean that I had access. So I still had to negotiate getting that access. So I had a lot of bottlenecks in terms of what campaigns I could look at. So initially I thought I was going to be looking at an oil and gas campaign, but they were quite skeptical of maybe me looking into some of their direct actions that were coming up. So that limited my opportunities to look into that campaign. So yeah, despite having these kind of like perceived like formal aspects of this collaboration, I still had to like negotiate my access right up until the end. So even when I got access into the Alternative Futures campaign, right up until the end, I think in like end of November 2022, my access was still withdrawn. So I'd have access to all these documents, and then without kind of any notice, all my access got withdrawn. So that was still like having to kind of negotiate that access throughout the whole process. So this kind of led to this kind of navigating like a two-way flow of skepticism between me and Greenpeace International. I think I was they were very skeptical of my researcher identity. I feel like I didn't really fit into maybe that activism space that they were working within. And then because of the very like back and forth nature of not being able to get access over maybe, I think I was trying for nearly like 7 months, it kind of made me question whether I would ever be able to get my data, or how much they would be able to kind of offer me in terms of also being able to deliver on my my research needs. So I think what really hindered this kind of collaborative approach from my perspective was there was a lack of understanding on both sides, I think. So there was a lack of understanding from myself, maybe, of the timeframes, the goals, the aims of like what Greenpeace needed or what would be useful for them. And I also think there was a lack of understanding on their side about the kind of timeframes, what data I needed for completing a PhD. So there just seemed to be a bit of a disconnect between an academic kind of space and this more activism, NGO organizational space. Next slide, please, Victoria. Could you go back one more slide, please, Victoria? Yeah, that's great, thank you. So yeah, it was quite interesting. So in the end, I did get access. So I had access to conduct interviews, and I conducted interviews with most of the team members. I also got access to a lot of their Google Drive documents, and I had like access to over 500 campaign documents. I also observed some of their meetings. So there was this I kind of entered into this weird place of like closeness and remoteness and this detachment and commitment. So yeah, I felt like close to the campaign in terms of that we have both had like a shared concern for environmentalism, understanding environmental issues. And I did feel integrated into the teams like Google Drive and team meetings, and I was really appreciative of that. But then I was also very much reminded of my remoteness in terms of our kind of differing approaches to how we are tackling environmental care and practice. My researcher identity, and just this unexpected removal of my research access. So I never very felt like truly integrated, or that I was fully conducting a collaborative approach, but at the same time, I never felt kind of fully excluded. I was in this kind of weird limbo space, I would say. Yeah, I also found that because of this closeness at points, I found during like my write-up that I was actually at points trying to sort of co-opting their voices. So wasn't being critical enough of maybe what they were saying. Yeah, and it was quite hard actually to maybe like, I guess like keep that kind of separateness between us, especially during that writing up stage. So yeah, that was definitely something where I had to develop my ability to kind of self-reflect, critically reflect on their campaign outputs. But also there was some level of objectivity in terms of like non-participation, not in terms of non-participation, sorry, but in terms of being bound to their organizational culture and their like socialization. So I never really kind of became one part of the team. So I wasn't part of maybe, yeah, like I say, their socializations within the team and their culture. So I could kind of keep some detachment in that sense. So in a way, I kind of was able to negotiate this kind of blend of indifference and involvement, which is where I kind of said like my positionality ended up lying. Yeah. Okay, next slide, please, Victoria. And I've kind of just coming towards the end of my PhD now. I'm literally got my first draft just done, so it's about to be sent off to my supervisors for the final check. So I'm kind of now in this like reflective stage of how useful has this research been? Is it going to be useful for Greenpeace at all? And hopefully I think it will be. That was yet to be seen. And I really like what Sylvia has done, how she kind of has created that report. And I think something like that would be really great to kind of give to them at the end. I think maybe what would have been good to have done as I was conducting the PhD was to kind of give these progressive updates in real time. And I think that could have been really, really useful for them, but that just didn't really happen in terms of the relationship we ended up kind of negotiating between ourselves. But yeah, creating these kind of accessible summary documents that use a lot of visuals that kind of break that very dry academic format, I think would be really, really useful in this kind of case. But also, I think another issue of this kind of collaborative research is that the timings of completing a PhD and the timings of a campaign work very, very differently. Campaigns will be changing like this, like every second they will be thinking of a new idea or going to a different path, whereas a PhD is a bit more of like a marathon than a sprint. So the timings just don't really match up. So it's how maybe we can try to get these outputs to them that are going to be useful, that yeah will fit within their timeframes. So yeah, there's some of the reflections that I've kind of had throughout my PhD journey, and I'm now going to pass over to Victoria.
Thank you, Ella and Sylvia. So hi again, everyone. And I'd like to take this opportunity to briefly introduce myself. So my name is Victoria L. Miara. I'm currently studying for my doctorate in science communication at the Technion. So how did I get there? Well, I studied agriculture and worked for many years in the public and private sectors, both in research, and I was also an in-house intellectual property specialist in a legal department. And while I was in the legal world, I started a pro bono position advocating for better, more just, more inclusive intellectual property rights for those in the agricultural sector. And this is the photo that you see to your left. And during that time, I went through a midlife crisis. So I didn't get a tattoo, I did something much worse. I decided to change careers. And it was also during COVID. But what I did realize is that I didn't want to advocate for intellectual property. I wanted to advocate for the environment. So I joined the entomology lab for applied ecology as an entry-level ecologist, which is the photo to your right. Note the subtle differences between the two photos. And my doctoral studies today are really a lesson into what environmental advocacy at the policy level means for scientists who are doing it. So now let's go back in time to 2021. And this is a short story about one of the collaborative projects I had the absolute privilege of joining when I was back at the Applied Ecology Lab. So some of you may be familiar with the IUCN Red List. So this is the international standard for endangered species. And our lab had collected years of citizen science and expert data about butterflies, and the plan was to create the very first IUCN Red List of endangered butterflies in Israel. Now, the majority of non-agricultural natural land, so that's reserves, parks, forests, is managed by two large organizations who we partnered up with. And our shared goal was to co-create a tool that would help protect endangered butterfly populations and habitat. So as well as a traditional book, which it has academic value, the information was also to be incorporated into an online tool with interactive maps. And the idea is that it would assist policymakers within those organizations. So they're in the Ministry of Environmental Protection and also a nonprofit organization with real world decisions. So I don't know about you, but this sounded great to me and I was so enthusiastic. And I mean, what could possibly go wrong, right? Oh, there we go. What could possibly go wrong? Okay, so soon after I had joined the project, I realized that our partnership was quite complicated. And why was that? Well, on the one hand, we were co-creating a joint tool. So each organization took on responsibilities, provided knowledge, practical know-how, staff hours. But on the other hand, in many respects, it was just a client-provider relationship with funding that was going in one direction from the government organization and the nonprofit toward the university. So in retrospect, the fact that our lab was positioned both as a co-creator and as a provider really complicated our relationship. And what I need to say is that the dual relationship wasn't communicated. It wasn't communicated verbally or contractually, as far as I know, but it did set the tone for the whole project. And what we need to keep in mind here is that the clients were the party who were going to utilize the tool. So they wanted it pronto, or at least within the agreed upon deadlines, okay? Which brings me to my next point, which is campaign timelines. So I'm a timely and organized person. And this was one of the reasons I was asked to join the project. So imagine my frustration when I needed deadlines pushed back time and again. And this was necessary because of the lack of designated personnel hours, which was something we had just not taken into account how much time it would take us. And there was also a need to adhere to the strict academic international standards of the IUCN, and this took up a lot of time. But this requirement not only strained what was an already complicated relationship, it was also unprofessional. And as the project drags on, this tool is still not being implemented, which means that butterfly populations are continuing to decline. So there is a drawback here. And finally, I found myself in many heated discussions about grazing. Grazing? Yes, indeed. So on the one hand, grazing is a practical method used to clear open spaces from brush and reduce fire hazards. But on the other hand, grazing can harm plant species that caterpillars thrive on, and it harms butterfly populations. So on paper, we don't have a conflict of interest, right? We all want to protect butterflies. And we also know that one of the main expected benefits of collaboration is that these projects allow for an alternative form of knowledge production, and the academics supply most of the scientific knowledge, where the other partners might provide the practical, the indigenous knowledge. But in reality, we just couldn't seem to agree on how best to protect butterfly habitats. So put yourself in my shoes. I really wasn't prepared for how difficult it would be to bring together these practical and scientific knowledge, information, and data into one tool. And I really didn't understand how we had reached this point where we were arguing endlessly about the optimal number of goats per hectare. So perhaps, Sylvia, you'd like to sum up with us, for us, with some takeaway messages.
Yeah, thanks, Victoria. So we basically have brought together our sort of reflections into this sort of conclusion slide, but obviously we can keep talking about these points. It's not necessarily that our perspective is the right one, but we're just sort of raising these as sort of advice points towards what we call comfortable collaboration. So just sort of managing some of those things that might come up that you're not expecting and that can be a bit uncomfortable. So first of all, managing expectations. So working with the partners before you actually start the project to set the expectations from both sides. Make sure everyone's on the same page about the outcomes. I think this is really important to make sure no one's disappointed and no one feels like they're letting the other side down. The second one is communicate with your partners throughout. So creating research summaries as the research progresses. This is something Ella touched on. It'd be nice to be able to give feedback to them as the research progresses, hopefully which benefits them as well, because that is, at the end of the day, the purpose of co-produced research is for the partners to benefit from it as much as the research. And second, allow your partners to shape the research as it progresses, but also be aware of your own research goals. So this is something along the lines of you may get swept up with what the organisation want rather than what the research side wants. And obviously they can be quite different things sometimes. The third point is to negotiate those relationships carefully, and it can be really tricky. And it's very normal, I think, for complicated relationships to emerge between the researcher and the participants. You know, you do work together. We are only human. You can have friendships, you can have arguments, you can dislike people, and that's all normal and part of doing social science research. And it can actually really help the research in a lot of cases. We shouldn't see that as a bad thing. Just treat ethics carefully, be responsible, be intuitive, and try not to, you know, do wrong by your partners. Fourth, knowledge is multifaceted. So this is an important part of collaborative research, I think, that practical knowledge and sort of knowledge, indigenous knowledge and knowledge of expertise and this type of thing, rather than academic knowledge, is just as important and can contribute a lot to the scientific aspects and create more sort of substantive research outputs. So reaching common ground together, building on both of those different forms of expertise is really important. And finally, discomfort can and probably will arise when you inevitably don't meet expectations. I think this is a really important part of collaborative research. At some point, you are going to feel like you're letting down your collaborative partners. And we think the most important thing here is that this is normal, and just to share this experience with other ECRs and peers and colleagues and with your advisors and your supervisors if you have that good relationship with them. I think this is my takeaway that I want to share with everyone, especially I hope this is the same for the other two panelists, that I think it's all we want to say really is that it's really important to open up spaces like this where we can share these experiences. I think that's the most important thing, because you can't get over some of these problems. You know, there's institutional things like funding and things that, you know, we as individuals necessarily can't change. We can raise awareness of, but the most important thing I think we can do is help the cohort of PhD students coming after us to feel a bit more comfortable in this situation. And just really open up space to share these experiences. I think certainly for me, my experience of doing collaborative research would have been much more positive if I'd been able to talk about these things rather than just worrying that I was doing research wrong, to just be able to share those experiences. So with that in mind, if you want to go to the next slide, we just wanted to use the rest of the session as a bit of a Q&A, but also more in the spirit of collaboration, open up the space to you guys as attendees to sort of share your experiences. We'd love to just hear from other people if anything we've said matches your experience or doesn't match, if there's anything you think we missed out. So yeah, feel free to ask us questions. We're happy to talk more about our research, but yeah, we'd like to sort of open up the floor to other people's experiences as well. So there's some prompts on the screen here for you to talk about, but yeah, very happy to hear from everyone else. So yeah, I think Danny, you've got your hand up if you want to speak.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you for the for sharing your experiences. It's been really enlightening, and especially because I'm not technically a researcher. I am well, first of all, my name is Danny. I'm based in Haifa, Israel, which, by the way, Victoria, it seems that we're neighbors, which is cool. I come from a little bit of like a different background in terms of I come from like a marketing communications background. I am a podcaster and live radio broadcaster, and so most of what I do is collaborating with people and with like people in different disciplines and different areas and things like that. And I think that, maybe not coming from like a rigid research space has allowed me to kind of, jump over some of the obstacles that researchers might face in terms of some of the, professional distance that people are trying to get. I mean, the last thing I want is distance, right? I want to feel like cool and chummy with people because that makes for better radio. And so one of the things that I have found that has been really helpful for me is kind of establishing from the beginning a sort of shared interest in that, we're all on the same side, right? I already texted in the chat a little bit. I don't know if, I'm just kind of repeating myself as a result of it. But there's always been between me and my collaborators a sense of camaraderie of like, okay, you guys are working for the environment, I'm working for the environment. Feels like we're not really competing here, and we can kind of take that step forward together and try to work on that. And so I'm wondering if, as researchers, it's kind of helpful to appeal to that sense of camaraderie, or if you didn't really find like that was useful at all. And to kind of wonder if there might be obstacles that overshadow that a little bit, because I guess I'm an idealist in the sense that I would really hope that that would work, but I'm not actually 100% sure. So I'd love it if you could share some experiences with that.
Yeah, does someone else want to take that first, respond?
Sure, I'll take that, Sylvia, thanks. So Danny, first of all, thank you for sharing your story, and it's quite interesting. And I think that it's nice that people are joining from all sorts of different aspects of their work. For me, I definitely came in feeling that that's what we would have, that joint collaboration feeling. And I think I tried to explain like how I just didn't understand how it had turned into something else. To me, that was the norm and what was expected. So I think that maybe you need to be aware of the fact that there might be some friction, even though you have common goals. Just because of the way you, as a researcher in the academic, within the academic organization, have to follow certain rules. You have to follow certain guidelines. I mean, we were on a very, very strict guidelines from the IECA, which meant that there were many things that were practically necessary, but we couldn't allow into the project because they're not academic enough. So it was quite complicated. And I think someone from one of the other organizations may have joined us, and she might want to say something. But I actually had a friend in one of the other organizations, and we're good friends. It's not that we're not in a camaraderie. We are still good friends, but within that professional context, we couldn't be on the same page. And it was, to me, it was sad, but this is the truth of it.
Yeah, I can kind of speak to that as well. That I think this comes back to your kind of positionality and where you kind of place yourself, because I think going into Greenpeace and knowing that it is such a big organization and has been around for a very long time, has a very like kind of established reputation, that I kind of thought that if I went in and, like you said, had this shared interest between us, that maybe that would help access. And in certain aspects it did. So I think like when I actually got access to my interviewees and I did my interviews, it was much more like conversations. And that was really nice. But it was that like initial trying to get access and certain campaigns that were very, even though we had that shared goal and I had kind of shared that, and even saying like I have worked in activism spaces, I have been involved in activism myself, didn't really seem to help in that situation. I think I was always going to be someone that wasn't within Greenpeace. Like I was always that person on the outside. And I think it was just, and I think as an organization, how they're set up is they are quite gated to outsiders in terms of information to do with their actions, which obviously can be quite disruptive. So I think it was more about like the leaking of information, and there was just a general distrust, even though they knew that I am obviously advocating for like the same kind of side, like that, yeah, there was just this like distrust there with certain groups. And I found also with the campaign that I worked with, when they started to get a bit more leverage and a bit more coverage across the Greenpeace campaign, that's when they started to get nervous about my access. It was having access to potential upcoming actions that they really didn't like me knowing about. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just jump in as well, I think it's a really interesting point you've raised, Danny. And yeah, I definitely agree with what the others have said, that it felt like that maybe would be more the case. And I think it's maybe for me comes back to the sort of relative lack of knowledge around what social science research is. I think in a lot of spaces, particularly in sort of climate change, there's a lot of understanding of physical science and climate science, and less so for what social science looks like and is. A lot of the journalists I spoke to were quite confused about what it is I was doing, and like how just having a conversation, because obviously as journalists they just approach someone and interview them ad hoc and whatever, and I was whipping out all these consent forms and participant information sheets and everything, and people were a bit confused about that. And the Calm Reef team themselves didn't really understand quite what I was doing there, just sort of sitting and watching, observing, and there's a bit of uncomfort there around like being observed as if they're like guinea pigs and things like that. So I think part of it was that sort of, yes, we're all on the same page in terms of environmental goals and climate goals, but fundamentally my goal was to have a PhD at the end of it. Like I was there to get data, whereas they were there to do their jobs. And in some ways I was getting in the way of that, by pestering them constantly, what are you up to? Can you talk me through this? Can you show me around this? So I think the sort of, those sort of ideal bigger term goals maybe do matter in terms of getting access to some extent, as Ella said, but day to day, it was much more sort of our daily interactions were more focused on the immediate goals. And obviously everyone works in a fast-paced environment. All the people we work with are quite busy people. We're in their organizational settings. We weren't speaking to communities in their homes. We were speaking to people in their workplaces when they've got a lot to do. So I think some of it is that, and this thing about a general lack of understanding about what social science actually looks like and is definitely came up quite a lot for me. And I think that can be part of this sort of mismatch of like a language barrier and a misunderstanding of what it is we're doing. But yeah, I think that definitely was part of it though, and I think it's cute to keep that in mind as like, and sometimes it was, we did have a lot of those sort of informal conversations of overall goals, joking about government actions for climate change and stuff like that. A lot of that did help with the sort of building rapport and like building relationships. So it's definitely useful in that informal way. But yeah, the sort of day-to-day working, obviously we've got completely different priorities. But yeah, that was really interesting. Thanks for raising it. It's nice to have sort of a different perspective from outside of research as well.
I think we had another question from Zoe in the chat. So she said, you all sort of touched on it, but did you feel like it was important to set boundaries between your collaborative work and your PhD research data, personal boundaries, data collection boundaries, etc.? And if so, how did you set those boundaries?
Maybe Zoe, you'd like to tell us a bit about yourself and where you're coming from and that sort of thing. I mean, feel free to share.
Sure. Hello, can you see me and hear me? Okay, cool. Hi, I'm Zoe. I am a second year PhD, and so I'm sort of going into maybe what you've all finished in terms of my data collection, which involves sort of maybe some sort of desk ethnography of working with an NGO. But yeah, I'm already kind of having these uncomfortable feelings of kind of what I share with them in terms of my own aims for the PhD, but also understanding what they want to get out of me working there, and literally what you just touched on, Sylvia, of kind of, I'm kind of observing them, and so I assume that they might feel uncomfortable with that. But yeah, so for me, I'm also struggling because I sort of do know these people that I will be working with and observing, but so they kind of know me now as just someone that's interested in their field of research. So kind of to have You know, I had my personal interest in this research, but also to set that boundary of, but I need to, you know, extract some data for the PhD. So yeah, that's kind of where my thoughts are struggling and going into kind of my data collection period.
Yeah, I mean, I can go first if you want. That sounds really cool. I would love to hear more about your research. And yeah, feel free to reach out afterwards. We can have another follow-up chat if you want, because I think it's really important, and I would have loved to speak to someone before I did this kind of work. So yeah, if it's sort of desk-based ethnography, I mean, there's a bunch of literature on sort of virtual ethnography, and I wrote in my PhD about what I called a hybrid ethnography, because it was partly online, remote, and partly in person. And the sort of in-person element worked better potentially because you're able to sort of build those relationships. But obviously a lot of that can be done over Zoom nowadays. But to be honest, it was something I really struggled with, this sort of setting boundaries. And looking back, I don't think I really did do it. And I think if I was to do the project again, I maybe would have been better at setting those boundaries. But also maybe not, because it also gave me a bunch of really great data that I wouldn't have got otherwise. And even sort of like I touched on, sort of these more confidential conversations about the inner workings of the team and like sort of tensions between certain people in the team and things that you wouldn't write down in your fieldwork notes, but it really helped me understand the team dynamics a lot better. And for quite a sort of deep qualitative social science, cultural studies type project that I ended up doing, that was exactly what I wanted to get at. So I use this concept called organizational culture quite a lot in my research, which was how you sort of get really embedded into the team dynamics, and the team sort of socializes you into their culture. And this was one of the strongest things I felt personally, is I just immediately, within a couple of weeks, felt like I'd always been there as part of the team. And it was almost like a cult. You really just get immersed in it to the point of being no longer feeling like a researcher, you're there as a team member. And I really enjoyed that, because I thought the team was brilliant. It was really, really fun to be part of them. And I definitely think it helped my research in the sense that you don't get those insights, that the depth of those insights, if you're not immersed to that degree. So, but it's a personal choice, right? Like I knew I sort of let myself get that immersed because I thought it would help me get more data, and I was just having a good time. And these were great people to be friends with. You know, we'd go out for drinks in the evenings and stuff. It was just great fun. And I think looking back, I could have maybe done better to set those boundaries. And it was definitely, like, in a sort of personal, like emotional way, it was quite intense. And after that period of fieldwork in Glasgow, I came home and I sort of crashed for about 2 weeks completely, because it was just so full on and intense. Like, you're working with these people full long days, and then we'd go out for dinner with a bunch of other people that I hadn't met. And I was, the whole time there was this pressure of like, I need to be writing notes, I need to be getting data, I need to be doing everything. And then you go home and you're writing up your ethnographic field notes until like midnight, and then, you know, get up really early and do it all again the next day. So it's very intense. And I think setting some boundaries and looking after my own sort of mental health a bit more would have definitely been a good thing to do. So that's something I would definitely try and keep an eye on. And I would say talk to your friends and you know, colleagues about it as you're going through it, because I think that's really important, to keep an eye on where you're at, and in terms of sort of burnout and things like that. This was something that came up in my Viva discussion, actually, was about burnout and how intense it was to do the data collection in this way. But yeah, I think it's sort of up to you. And I think there's a lot of different perspectives in the sort of literature about ethnography, about how good or bad it is to be fully immersed. And I think some of it is a sort of personal choice, and also sort of it's informed by the sort of discipline you're coming from as well, how sort of detached you need to be. So yeah, I can see Danny's put in the chat, you know, sort of leaning into the subjectivities of the research, and that's exactly what I did. I wrote quite a lot in my thesis about how I would not have got the research I got if it wasn't for this deep immersion and feeling like I was one of them, and identification. So I think for me that was really helpful, but I can see how it came with a lot of personal challenges. So it's something you need to kind of balance and think about, to be honest. And hopefully with it being maybe a bit more desk-based and maybe remote, perhaps, that might be a little bit easier to stay kind of separate. But yeah, for me, I lent into it fully, and I think I had a great experience and got some great data from that. But I can definitely see the benefits of staying a little bit more detached, and sort of setting boundaries around your time would be really helpful as well. Like, you know, yeah, like it would have been good for me to be like, I'm working as a journalist now, and now I'm a researcher, and now I'm collecting data. But reality just doesn't really work like that. But yeah, I think it's up to you, and I think it just needs sort of thinking about and checking in with yourself regularly throughout the data collection period about what's working and what isn't. But yeah, setting boundaries around sort of what counts as research data and what doesn't is definitely useful. And that might be a conversation with the partners, or it might just be something you're doing sort of independently or with your supervisors. But yeah, I'm happy to chat more about this offline if you want, because it sounds really cool. So yeah, anyone else got any reflections on that?
I'll just jump in quickly. I know, Zoe, I'm going to have a conversation with you at some point later on in a couple of weeks' time, because we're both based in Leicester. So yeah, just wanted to say about those kind of boundaries. I think something that would have worked really well for me is really establishing those right at the beginning before I even started data collection. I think, I don't really know. I think, like I said, I think in my presentation, I think there was just a really big misunderstanding between myself and Greenpeace International of kind of what responsibilities we both had to make this kind of research work. They're very, very busy. And obviously I was working to the timescale of a PhD as well. So I think it was just like that initial meeting should have been very much like, this is what I need from you, what can you give to me, and what is your boundaries and what are my boundaries. And I think if we'd had that conversation very much early on, I think it would have been a lot better. I did find, like I said, when I had my interviews, that kind of relationship did break down, as in was developed, as in it got better, as in I felt like I was talking to friends or there was some commonality between us. But then and I think this kind of reiterates what Sylvia was saying as well, when you go back into that kind of academic space where you then, the interview's finished and you need to then go and transcribe it all, you feel like, okay, now I'm back into my research identity and actually I'm not as connected to them as I thought I was. But yeah, I think also that's a really good point that Danny was saying in the chat as well about leaning into the fact that it can be subjective. And if you put that into your methods and you say, I'm always aware of this and I was like reflective of it, and that actually it was maybe beneficial in terms of the data I managed to get, I think is a really good point, and something that I found actually quite nice to talk about when I've been writing up my PhD. I found that bit quite liberating to write, just kind of talking through like my positionality and stuff. Yeah.
I'd actually like to respond to Danny's second question about the private sector project. So he wrote, private sector projects tend to move quickly because there's a financial incentive for that efficiency. And I wonder what kind of incentives can be implemented in collaborative projects to reach a similar level of efficiency and workflow streamlining. So I will say that I actually moved straight from 7 years in the private sector to going back to working as an academic in a university. And I found it really, really frustrating because once you've worked in the private sector and you're used to efficiency, streamlining, and that sort of workflow idea, going back to the way academics work is just, it's so slow and it's so inefficient. But what I did realize, I think, is that it really, once you don't have a financial incentive, and you do have a very, very strong incentive to work slowly, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but I mean that in academics, you really need to be robust with your methods, and you need to double check and triple check everything. I'll give you an example. We had the names of the butterflies, the Latin names, and the person who was in charge of this project wanted not only the name of the person who had come up with the name in the 1800s, he wanted us to look for the literature and cite it. Literature from the 17 or 1800s. I mean, it's literally impossible. It would have taken us decades to do that kind of research. But this is the sort of thing that academic minds get into. It's like we have to be professional. This is how they view professionalism as opposed to how the private sector views professionalism, which is stay by your contract, do things in time. Very different. So what I can answer to that is, if you do work on something with someone within the university or an academic setting, you need to take that into consideration and to really set sort of standards about how things are going to look like. That's my opinion on that. Yeah, sure. I'm happy to hear.
I'm so sorry. I promise I'll stop.
Oh, please.
So there's sort of like a long running ongoing conversation in my head between how much I really appreciate the rigorous methodological approach of academia in terms of uncovering new information and new approaches and things like that, and kind of advancing our understanding of human knowledge, and the fast-paced, really burning necessity to do something about the environmental issues that we're facing. And I mean, I guess more than a question, it's a little bit of like a reflection that I'm constantly going through about how much would be kind of willing to compromise on that rigorous methodological approach if it means advancing important information techniques more quickly. Because yeah, I mean, there's always going to be a trade-off, right? I don't think there really is such thing unless we had like unlimited funding, which would be awesome. We can't really move incredibly quickly like a lot of us would feel kind of that sense of urgency to. I don't know, I don't really have like a specific question, but it's kind of just something I'd like to throw into the air, because I really wish that the advances that we can make methodologically through the kind of this like scientific academic approach could fall in line with the objectives of, hey, let's maybe prevent the planet from burning and the oceans being on fire.
Yeah, if I can just jump in, I think that's a really definitely key point, and it's something I'm struggling with quite a lot now in my postdoc role. I'm working with a lot of different external partners on a lot of small projects, and something that's really holding us up is ethics applications to do research. So it takes my university around 6 to 8 weeks to review and approve an ethics application, and I'm doing this consulting work for an external partner that only lasts 2 months. And I'm supposed to be delivering all this social science qualitative research, and it's just completely unfeasible with the ethics application process. And I've raised it with, the faculty level and the department level quite a lot, because it's just really getting in the way of us producing useful research which could impact industry and policy right away, like you said. And I don't really know what the way of getting over that is, other than just speeding up the process, because it is important, obviously, to have this like ethical oversight. It is really important that we do that, and things like data protection and GDPR and things like that do need assessing. So it's, yeah, I don't really see what the solution is, other than just starting the conversations earlier and making sure everyone's aware of these stepping stones on the way. And obviously projects do take time anyway, so if you can still be progressing in other areas while you're waiting for those institutional barriers to kind of be overcome, I think that might be a way of doing it. But yeah, I agree that it's definitely a bit of a mismatch between the private sector, and this is why I think a lot of people end up leaving academia and doing the same kind of high impact research, but outside of academia, because you're not held up by those same constraints. But again, academia has got the sort of robust background and the sort of, stamp of approval, because it has all those things in place to make sure the research is conducted ethically and fairly and rigorously. And it's a trade-off, yeah, and I don't really see what the solution is. You're right, and I think it's important that we speak to the private sector a lot more to sort of get feedback on that. Yeah, Elliot, do you want to?
Yeah, just wanted to say that it's kind of coming towards the end of this session. Sorry, Sylvia, kind of cutting off there. But maybe if there is maybe one more question we can take, or any kind of reflection from someone else, and then we'll kind of close the session. Maybe, yeah, we run over 5 minutes, so it should be all right. But if people need to get to other sessions, also feel free to move on to those other sessions. Any more questions or anything? Okay. I think this has been, for me, and hopefully for everyone else here, has been such a useful session. And I think it's just like what Sylvia was saying, that we need to have these conversations. I think we can learn so much from each other, and that, yes, it would be great to keep in touch with a few people that are kind of going through this similar process, or any other kind of insights. I think it was really great to get some insights from that more kind of practitioner perspective as well, and how we kind of do like foster these collaborations. So yeah, please do reach out to us. I'm just going to quickly share this. Hopefully everybody can see that. So this is just a quick note. So my role is also as the early career representative for the IECA. So any early careers out there that do want to get involved more in the IECA, please reach out to me. My name's Muncie. But also for those joining, please consider joining our network. These are all the kind of contacts that you need. Our Facebook page, Twitter page, our website. and hopefully we can do more kind of sessions like these, because I think they're really, really productive to have these conversations. So I just wanted to say thank you so much to my co-presenters, and thank you so much for everyone joining, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and please join other sessions if you have the time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.